Opposition leader Malcolm Turnbull spent 2 days in Afghanistan earlier this month, and he joins us now in our breakfast studio. Malcolm Turnbull, welcome to ABC Radio National Breakfast.
Yes, good morning, Fran.
Malcolm Turnbull, the death of another Australian soldier in Afghanistan, Private Benjamin Renato. Last week, I think it was 15 British soldiers were killed there. Is this war worth the human cost?
This is the front line in the war against terrorism, Fran. When we were there earlier this month, we were so impressed by the courage, the professionalism, the commitment, the very high morale of our troops, young men and women, serving us there in Afghanistan. This is really the front line in the battle against global terrorism. It is a war we have to win, and it's a war we will win.
Not everyone agrees with you, not surprisingly, I suppose, but in the press today, prominent defence analyst Hugh White says he doesn't believe Afghanistan will change the terrorism threat on our doorstep. He also says there's little chance of success in Afghanistan, and therefore an Australian government can't really justify the human cost.
Well, I believe that Private Renato was fighting a vital battle against terrorism, a vital war. He died under our flag, wearing our uniform, and he and the other soldiers that have died there have made the supreme sacrifice in a vital battle. What signal would we send to terrorism in Indonesia if we were to abandon the battle against terrorism in Afghanistan? The reality is, if you look at the military situation there, what is our strategy? Our strategy, by that I mean that of all the Allied forces there, our strategy is to suppress insurgent activity, to give the Afghan government the breathing space to build up its Afghan National Army and its National Police. And of course it was part of the Mentor and Reconstruction Task Force that is doing precisely that work. It is part of that work that Private Renato was undertaking. So he was working there with the Afghan National Army, with many other Australians, helping to build it up so that it can, after it's taken advantage of this breathing space, take over all of the security for Afghanistan, and of course then the foreign troops can leave.
Talk about sending signals to terrorists in Indonesia. It's now been suggested that Western businessmen, amongst them many Australian businessmen actually, were deliberately targeted in the terrorist attacks in Jakarta on Friday. I mean, is there something more the Australian government could or should be doing to send a signal to terrorists? Any more that can be done?
Well, those three Australians are tragic casualties at the hands of these murderous terrorists, Fran. The Australian government has to be constantly vigilant. I believe we are doing a good job in cooperating with Indonesia. These hotels had very high levels of security, and it is a matter of real concern that the terrorists were able to penetrate them. And I think what the terrorists were seeking to make a point that nowhere in Jakarta is safe, because these hotels had one of them had been hit before, of course, and they had very high levels of security. These are also tragedies in this war against terrorism. They're victims, and we should be very, very conscious of the heavy price those three men and, of course, their families are paying now.
But you're in lockstep with the government, the Rudd government, on its approach to the issues and the war on terror.
Absolutely. We give the government 100% support in helping Indonesia deal with this problem of terrorism, and the federal police are already there providing support. And as we have done in the past, and as we should always do, let's hope we don't have to do so in the future. Let's hope they can suppress terrorism in Indonesia. But if they don't, and they can't, then we should be there to support them.
Not so supportive of the government and how its handling of the Stern Hu affair in China. If you'd been Prime Minister, what would you have done?
Well, I would have called the Chinese president or the Prime Minister. Really, I think Mr. Rudd missed an opportunity there to register our very real concern. And then he defended his do-nothing attitude for a week, basically, and then called a press conference and in rather belligerent language, threatened China with some unspecified economic consequences in respect of the Hu case. So he swung from inaction to megaphone diplomacy, and of course in the middle, which was what we were recommending, was the measured, responsible approach of picking up the telephone.
So you would have picked up the phone to President Hu Jintao and said what?
Well, I would have said that we were very concerned in Australia about the arrest of this very senior Australian executive working for a major Australian mining company in China. I'd say we were very concerned that he was being held without access at that point to consular officials, to his lawyers, to his family, to his employers, that we wanted him to have access to those people immediately, and we wanted to be assured that he would be brought before a court or not. If he's not brought before a court, of course, he should be released, but if there were charges to be laid, they should be laid promptly, and just simply registered our concern as I believe the Chinese would have expected us to do. You see, my problem, Fran, is this. My problem with Kevin Rudd is this. He sent a signal to Beijing that he wasn't really concerned about Stern Hu. You see, you've got to ask yourself, how would it be interpreted? The Prime Minister does nothing. Can that be interpreted as anything other than the Prime Minister saying, this is not of sufficient importance for me to take up? Look,
but if the end game is results, what difference do you think that would have made? You saying to the President, I want him to get legal access, consular access as quickly as possible, and if charges aren't laid, let him go. Do you think it would have made any
absolutely.
difference?
I think it would have. It would certainly encourage the Chinese officials to move the process along. If they had a charge, to lay the charge, to give him access to lawyers and his employee. You see what often happens in these international affairs is that you get something blowing up in the press in one country, and the government of that country will say to the government of another country at a prime minister to prime minister level, yes, it's a political issue here, but don't be too concerned about it. There's people, often heads of government, will play down issues that appear to have domestic political ramifications. Now, what Mr. Rudd was doing by not acting was creating the impression, in my view, in my judgment, that he was not as concerned about Stern Hu's case as public opinion in Australia would suggest. And I think that was a big mistake, because he sent a message of a lack of concern. And all of this stuff about, softly, and you've got to be quiet, and even some people who I think are just craven and cowardly. There are people out there, particularly in the media, some journalists saying, oh, we shouldn't raise anything with the Chinese because it would affect our economic relationship. Well, what price human rights? What price Stern Hu's human rights? I mean, the reality is the Chinese respect people who stand up for their rights. So I could just say again, I've said this before,
I'm not
Fran,
so sure about that. They've just disbarred all the human rights lawyers in China.
Fran, there is no point knuckling down to people who reject or human rights or there's no point. There is no point being cowardly. Just remember this. If you want to earn the respect of people, you've got to stand up for what you believe in. In 1949, when Chairman Mao succeeded in his revolution and he got to the top of Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, in Beijing, right there in the centre of the capital, his first words were, the Chinese people have stood up. That's what he said. The Chinese people have stood up. China respects nations that stand up for their own rights and stand up for their own citizens. So Kevin Rudd's complacency for that first 10 or 11 days can only be interpreted by a proud nation, China, as a lack of interest in Mr. Stern Hu. It was an error on Mr. Rudd's part, a major error. It sent exactly the wrong signal.
It's 14 to 8 on Breakfast. Our guest this morning is Opposition Leader Malcolm Turnbull. Malcolm Turnbull, if I can move to the Oscar affair, there are two reports pending now, we know, from the Auditor-General and also the Australian Federal Police. When are they due? Do you have any information on this?
You have to ask them.
Do you think you'll get to see these reports before they're made public?
Well, I have no idea, Fran. It's really up to the police and the Auditor-General.
I know previously you've said that you cooperated with the Federal Police when they came around. Have they been back for a second time, a follow-up interview? Have you been asked to give any more information to these inquiries?
Well, the Federal Police Commissioner made it quite clear that I'd provided full cooperation and that there was no need for any further interaction with me, I think was what he said.
And I just wonder, have you had any interaction, any contact with the public servant at the centre of this, Gordon Gretsch, since it all blew up?
No, I have not.